A scream tore through the silence, sharp, raw, like a final cry for help in a world frozen white. A wild Mustang had plunged through the ice of a frozen lake. And what followed was a breath-stealing rescue. Carried out by two men, armed with nothing but a single rope. And not a second to spare. No rescue team. No gear. No way back. Only instinct, and something no one saw coming. That fall sparked a collision of fate. And a meeting no one believed was possible. With an ending you'll never forget. Stay with us, because the truth is only just beginning to emerge. Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. January. The cold here isn't the kind you measure with a thermometer. It seeps into your pores, crawls through your bones, and hangs in the air like an invisible god, freezing the world solid with a final breath. The ancient pine trees stood frozen, draped in white, like legions of stone warriors trapped in time. No birds. No wind. Just silence, heavy, endless, like an omen that hadn't yet found its name. Silas Creed had never believed in omens. But today, he wasn't so sure. He sat alone by a stack of cut wood, his heavy axe slung over his shoulder, flannel shirt thick like tree bark. His face was weathered by wind, chiseled by time, a silver-streaked beard tracing the edges of a square jaw. A man who had survived war. Survived loss. Survived himself. Now, all he had left was the forest. Beside him, a younger man, Jonas Keene, wrestled with a bundle of freshly split logs. Barely in his 20s, Jonas still carried the wide-eyed wonder of someone new to the wild. His breath puffed out in little clouds, his gloved hands slapping his thighs to stay warm. If we keep this pace, we'll finish the first load by sundown, Jonas said. Might beat the storm. Silas didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the distant ridge, where the sun was no more than a faint sliver behind thick, steel-gray clouds. Something was crawling up his spine. Quiet. Cold. And then... crack. A sound like the world splitting apart. Followed by a scream, a high, piercing shriek that tore through the snow-packed silence like a soul trying to escape its cage. Silas stood up fast. Jonas whipped around. What was that? The lake, Silas said. His voice was low. Eyes wide. Run. They bolted, snow crashing around their knees, dead branches clawing at their coats. Neither spoke. Silas's heart thundered, not just from the sprint. That sound, that cry, it echoed in him. Familiar. But not explainable. It only took 3 minutes to reach the lake. But for them, it felt like 3 years. And there it was. A horse. Massive. Midnight black. Thrashing in a jagged hole in the ice. Water sprayed skyward with each desperate kick. The broken ice around him looked like shattered knives. The animal clawed at the surface with his hooves, trying to pull himself up, then slipping again. Again. Each time, a splash of red bloomed beneath him. Blood. Oh my God, Jonas whispered. Silas said nothing. His eyes locked onto the horse. It wasn't a ranch horse. No bridle. No saddle. No brand. But it didn't panic like a wild animal either. It was fighting. With purpose. Then, the horse looked at him. And in that single moment, time folded inward. The horse, half submerged in the freezing lake, looked directly into Silas's eyes. And what stared back was not wildness, not fear, not the glassy stare of death, but something else. Something human. An unspoken question. A plea. And, somehow, a thank you, given before rescue had even begun. Silas drew a sharp breath. His whole body paused, like he'd just heard a language older than words, something only those who'd lost deeply could recognize. He turned to Jonas. "You got rope?" Jonas nodded slowly, still locked on the scene. "Yeah, but what are you?" Silas didn't answer. He looked at the lake, at the trembling horse, then said, softly but firmly, "Get the long plank from the truck. And the pulley hook. You're going out there?" "Not want to. Need to." Jonas hesitated. But Silas's eyes left no room for argument. As Jonas ran, Silas turned back to the horse. It was still watching him. No blinking. No thrashing now. Just waiting. And Silas thought, "You're not just a horse. You're a question I haven't found the answer to yet." And in that frozen moment, he understood. Whether or not he saved it, he was the one being saved. Jonas returned, a long wooden plank over his shoulder and a coil of rope hanging loosely at his hip. His breath curled thick in the frozen air like dry smoke. His hands trembled, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the fear steadily rising in his chest. Silas knelt down, eyes still fixed on the horse. The stallion had stopped thrashing. It was now gasping in short, shallow bursts, its entire body trembling beneath the icy water. But its eyes were still open, still locked on Silas, as if the last thread of its life was anchored in that gaze. "Tie the rope to that tree," Silas ordered, voice low but steady. "You sure about this?" Jonas asked, breath catching in the wind. "No," Silas replied, flatly. "But you see anyone else around?" Jonas hesitated, then nodded. He wrapped the rope around the base of an old pine, twice, 3 times, tightening it with all the strength he had. Silas looped the other end around his waist, fastened the knot, gave it a firm tug. The plank was laid out across the ice, stretching from the lake's edge toward the jagged break. Under Silas's weight, it creaked, groaned like something alive. He began to crawl. Slow. Deliberate. Like a ghost sliding across the snow. One hand gripped the rope, the other pressed against the frozen plank. His breath came in white bursts, crystallizing and vanishing with the wind. Each inch forward brought a warning, an ominous crack from the ice below, as if death itself was whispering beneath him. Behind him, Jonas knelt, holding the rope like it was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Every sound, every crack, made his heart cease. Every instinct screamed, "Stop him!" But Silas kept moving. Until he was within reach, just 1 arm's length from the broken edge where the horse was slowly slipping under. He stopped. Their eyes met again. The horse didn't blink. Didn't flinch. It was waiting. Like it had been, for him. "I'm here," Silas whispered. "I've got you." He threw the rope. Missed. Tried again. Missed again. Third throw, the loop landed around the horse's neck. Not perfect, but secure enough. The horse jerked slightly, but didn't fight. Didn't panic. It simply quivered, and stayed still. Silas gave the rope a testing pull. "Jonas! Get ready to haul, on my call." "Ready!" Silas tightened his grip, feeling the icy water soak through his jacket, through his skin, straight into his bones. His whole body trembled, but his hands didn't let go. Now. They pulled. slow, straining, like dragging a mountain uphill. The ice groaned, then cracked. A small piece gave way under Silas, water lapping at the plank, slicing through his layers like knives. The horse dug in with its front hooves, trying to find purchase. They slipped. Tried again. Its eyes widened, nostrils flared, breath ragged. Water streamed from its soaked mane. On the third try, its hooves caught the edge. Silas didn't wait. He lunged forward, grabbing the horse's mane with one hand, the rope with the other. The muscles under his grip trembled like live wires. The ice beneath his back burned with cold, but he didn't let go. Now, pull harder! Jonas shouted through clenched teeth, digging in and hauling with everything he had. Then, suddenly, the horse surged upward. Its front half scraped onto the plank, water pouring off its sides. The movement knocked Silas backward, nearly throwing him off, but he held on. He had to. The horse collapsed forward, gasping, unmoving. Its eyes, still open, still locked on him. Jonas ran forward, grabbed the rope. Together, they pulled again. The board creaked, threatening to snap. But it held. And finally, all three of them, man, horse, and board, lay sprawled on the snowy shore. The rope lay draped across Silas's chest. His breath came hard, his eyes shut tight. The world buzzed in his ears. A faint sound, like a sigh. He opened his eyes. The horse lay beside him, trembling. Not fighting. Not afraid. Just breathing, shallow and broken. Like the wind was speaking through it. "You okay?" Jonas called, crouching over him. Silas didn't respond right away. He pushed himself up with stiff arms, then looked quietly at the horse. "It's not moving," he said softly. "But I can feel it waiting, like it's been rescued before, and is trying to believe it can be again." Jonas said nothing. He just sat there, watching with him. The cold still wrapped around them. But somewhere, in the middle of all that snow and ice, something had begun to melt. Something neither of them dared to name. Snow began falling again as they pulled the horse back toward the cabin. Not the kind that slashes like razors, but the quiet kind, gentle as breath, cold as silence. It landed on shoulders and foreheads and melted slowly, like tears that had waited too long to fall. Silas's truck rumbled along the frozen trail, tires skidding just enough to remind them of the risk. He kept both hands firm on the wheel. In the back, Jonas sat with the horse, holding the rope loosely draped around its neck, like someone cradling a question no one dared to answer. The horse didn't resist. It didn't whinny. Didn't pull. It just looked. Always watching. As if it wasn't asking anything anymore. Just waiting to see if man could keep his promise. The cabin sat nestled in a thinning patch of woods, its back against the mountains like a hermit refusing to be found. Silas had built it over a decade ago, after leaving town, after walking away from every pitying glance and every question too heavy to ask. It had been just him all this time. And now, one more soul had joined him. Jonas laid out thick straw in the old hunting pen, a space once meant for hounds. Silas fed the cast iron stove with dry pine, the crackle of fire rising like tentative heartbeats in the cold. They dried the horse with towels, slow and careful, then draped a wool blanket across its back, worn, but warm. "You see it?" Jonas whispered. "No tags. No chip. No brand." Silas nodded slowly. "Doesn't belong to any ranch. Doesn't belong anywhere, Jonas murmured. Then, after a pause, he added, I want to call him Winterheart. Silas turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. Because he came back from the dead, Jonas explained. And because of his eyes. It's like he understands that real cold doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within. Silas didn't answer. But he looked at the horse longer. Winterheart. It sounded like a vow. Or a scar. Silas stayed with the horse as night draped the cabin in stillness. Jonas had gone back down the trail to the main camp, carrying word of what happened, and a promise to return with feed and clean water. The fire glowed in the corner of the shed. Silas didn't sleep. He sat hunched in an old wooden chair, hands clasped loosely, his eyes fixed on the creature they'd pulled from the ice. Like it was the final puzzle of his life, unsolvable, but sacred. Winterheart could stand now, though unsteady. He circled the pen once, slow and deliberate, then stopped in front of Silas. No snorting. No pawing at the floor. No fear. He stepped forward, once. Then back, once. Silas narrowed his eyes. You testing me? The horse moved again, one step closer. Slower this time. Then gently, so gently, lowered his forehead against Silas's shoulder. Silas froze. No one had touched him like that in 10 years. Not a handshake. Not a polite embrace. But this was something else. A gesture made for people who had lost everything and still chose to stay. Something wet slid down Silas's cheek. Maybe snow. Maybe not. The fire snapped in the hearth. Wind howled through the chinks in the wooden walls, echoing like ghosts from another world. Silas didn't move. Winterheart didn't either. Two souls, each carrying things they'd never said aloud, sharing a silence neither was afraid of. Eventually, Silas rose and stepped outside. He needed air. Truthfully, he needed space to breathe. Each footstep left its mark in the settled snow. He stopped beneath the tall pine near the porch, looking up. No stars. Only clouds, gray, endless. But for the first time in a long while, the stillness didn't feel like it was swallowing him whole. From inside the cabin came a soft sound, a faint whinny. Not loud, but enough to bring him back in. He sat down again, and the memories came flooding in. His wife, Emma, had died in a car crash on her way to the army base, hoping to see their son one last time before he was deployed to the Middle East. Their son, Caleb, was killed days later by shrapnel during a supply escort. 2 phone calls, less than a week apart. The first came with screaming, the second with silence. He had screamed once too. Smashed things. Then fell into a silence so deep people thought he'd lost his mind. He hadn't. He'd just lost everything. That's when he left town. Not out of rage, but because he had no reason left to stay. And now, in the 10th winter in Bitterroot, a creature with no name, no past, and no mark had rested its head on his shoulder, as if it understood. Close to dawn, Silas stirred from a light, aching sleep, still slumped in the chair. His neck was stiff. His back sore. But his chest was warm. Winterheart was no longer standing. He lay curled on the straw, his head resting softly on Silas's lap, eyes half closed, breath even. Wounds still marked his hide, but the bleeding had stopped. And somehow, he looked at peace. Silas didn't dare move. His hand reached out, gently brushing the horse's mane. Warm. Soft. Real. He whispered, unsure if to the horse or to the quiet. "Thank you for coming back." And in that moment, he knew. It had been so long since he'd felt alive. The snow had stopped by midday, leaving behind a pale gray sky and a crust of ice-white ground, cold as rock salt. Jonas returned carrying sacks of oats, ointment for wounds, and a few quiet jokes to break the silence lingering in the cabin. But Silas didn't laugh. He barely spoke. Winterheart was still lying in the stall, his breath steady, his eyes occasionally drifting towards Silas every time the man stepped near. There was something about the horse's presence that shifted the air inside the cabin, turning it from a mere shelter into something sacred. As if life was quietly blooming again in the dead of winter. By afternoon, while they were fixing the rear door hinges, an engine rumbled in the distance. Familiar, but not from Jonas's crew. Silas lowered the hammer, squinting toward the trail. A black SUV, polished and silent, rolled steadily over melting ice. The out-of-state license plate gleamed under the gray light. It came to a stop without honking. A woman stepped out. Her coat was ash-gray fur, falling to her knees. Her boots were old leather, worn but strong. Her face was weathered and lined, her silver hair braided tightly beneath a fur cap. Her eyes, pale and piercing, like winter clouds, locked onto Silas with such clarity he felt momentarily transparent. "Silas Creed?" she asked. Her voice was husky but firm. Silas nodded, one hand still resting instinctively on the hammer. Jonas stepped out from the stall, standing beside him. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Margot Rivers," she said, pausing briefly. Her eyes flicked to the horse whose head was now peeking through the stall bars. "And I think I once knew your horse." Inside the cabin, Margot sat upright at the wooden table, her calloused hands wrapped around a steaming tin mug. Outside, Winterheart was still lying down, head lifted slightly, eyes fixed on the window from which her voice came. "5 years ago," Margot began, "I ran a PTSD equine therapy center for veterans, up in Flathead Valley. We used horses, not just for riding, but for healing. There was one horse, special." Her voice softened. "He wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of shouting. Didn't bolt when someone panicked. He did the opposite, he approached. He would press his head into a trembling soldier's shoulder. Once, a young vet nearly lost control, collapsed in the yard. Before anyone could react, that horse knelt down beside him. Head bowed. No one trained him to do that. He just knew." Silas stared at her, his brow furrowing. "We called him Ironfoot," she continued, "because his steps were heavy and grounded. Like every hoof was a pillar." Jonas stood frozen. And then, Margot sighed. On the way to a new center in Colorado, the transport van skidded during a snowstorm. The driver survived, but Ironfoot vanished. All tracks erased by the blizzard. We thought he was gone." Silas said nothing for a long while. The wind slipped through a cracked rear window, rustling the curtain. He rose quietly and walked toward the stall. Winterheart stood up as Silas approached, legs still unsteady but eyes bright. Silas opened the gate. Margot followed, silent, reverent. She said nothing, just stepped closer, each footfall careful, like not to shatter something sacred. Winterheart turned his head. Their eyes met. And then, like a ghost come home, he bowed. One front leg bent, neck folding low, his forehead touching the ground. Margot gasped. Jonas's mouth fell open. Silas stood still as stone. "Oh God," Margot whispered, tears sliding down her wind-chilled cheeks. "He remembers." Winterheart, Ironfoot, held that pose for a long moment, as if honoring something beyond language. That night, they sat around the table. No one ate much. Margot spoke more of the horse's past. How he stood beside veterans too broken to stand on their own. How he never flinched during night terrors. How he always chose the weakest in the group and stayed with them. Silas listened in silence. When only the firelight and the soft crackling of wood remained, he finally spoke. "Maybe I didn't just save him." Margot looked up. "Maybe," he paused, then continued, "he was sent to save what was still human in me." No one said another word. But in Winterheart's gaze, still, deep, and quiet as first snow, they all understood. The next morning, the wind changed direction. A dry, sharp cold swept in from the north. Margot stayed one more night, helping Jonas treat Winterheart's leg wounds and sharing stories only those who'd worked with therapy horses would understand. But it was Silas, the man of silence, who stayed up nearly the entire night, listening to the sound of the horse breathing through the thin wooden wall. By noon the following day, Margot packed up. She didn't say much. She simply placed a hand on Winterheart's neck, smiled, and whispered, "You're better now. You've found the one who needed you." That afternoon, the sky turned gray. Jonas's old radio crackled out a high-level blizzard warning, strong winds, low visibility, severe freeze risks across Bitterroot. They fortified the cabin, stacked extra firewood, laid more straw, and secured every window shut with rock-cut planks. As darkness fell, the snow began. First a gentle dusting, then thicker, heavier. The wind howled like something lost in the trees, wild and desperate. Jonas was tending the fire when the cabin door flew open. A man burst in, completely dusted in white, panic stretched across his face. "Jake's not back." He took the snowmobile to check the generator by the slope hours ago, still no sign. Silas shot up. No questions needed. Instinct moved his hands, grabbing the lantern, rope, wind jacket. But as he stepped outside, something stopped him cold. Winterheart stood in the doorway. Didn't whinny. Didn't block. Just stood there. Staring. "No," Silas said, hoarsely. "Not now." But the horse didn't move. He tapped a hoof gently against the floor, then stepped back, just once, like an invitation. And in his eyes, deep and bright like fire inside ice, wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. The look of someone who had walked this storm before. Jonas whispered, "Sir, what if he really knows?" Silas didn't want to believe it. But he also couldn't look away. He gripped the reins, threw on another layer, and whispered, "All right then, lead the way, Winterheart." They crossed the woods under white fury. Wind lashed their faces like 100 tiny blades. Snow swallowed all trails. But Winterheart never hesitated. Each step measured. Head bowed into the gale. Ears sharp for every sound. When Silas veered too far, the horse would stop. When he faltered, the horse would nudge him forward. After half an hour, they found the overturned snowmobile, tilted off a slope near the frozen creek. Jake, young, quiet, steady Jake, was pinned between two trees, one leg bent wrong, blood soaking into the snow. Silas dropped to his knees. "Jake! You hear me?" Jake's lips were blue. His voice barely a breath. Cold, so cold. They were out of time. If they didn't move fast, the mountain would take him. Silas scanned the clearing. No sled. No stretcher. Just rope, old blankets. And Winterheart. He hesitated. But then their eyes met. And he knew he didn't need to ask. The horse was ready. They wrapped Jake tight, secured the rope around his torso. Winterheart lowered himself, no resistance, no fear. Silas fixed the harness with practiced hands, then leaned close. Slow, he whispered. One step at a time. Winterheart pulled. Steady. Strong. The ground was slick with ice, but his hooves never slipped. With every step, Jake was pulled a little closer, to survival. When they reached the cabin, the whole camp erupted. People ran out. Medics took Jake inside, straight to the heating tent. Silas collapsed in the snow, breath gone. Winterheart just stood in the storm. Didn't move. Didn't lift his head. Just stood there. Like a monument, carved from snow and silence. The next morning broke with sunlight after the blizzard. Jake was stable. The story spread. Then was retold. Then was captured in a photo. One of the crew snapped it. Winterheart, standing in front of the cabin, snow clinging to his mane, wind still tugging at the edges of the storm. Beside him, an empty wooden sled. The caption read simply, "The Silent Healer." The image spread. First through the veterans' internal chat. Then to a trauma therapy forum. Then to a local paper. Then to an old military newsletter. A week later, Silas received the first letter. It was from a soldier in Oklahoma. He wrote, "I don't know if it's really him. But 5 years ago, at a therapy center, there was a horse who stood beside me for 3 hours when I panicked. He never left. Not once. I never forgot those eyes. If the horse in that photo is real, please tell me he's still alive." Then more letters came. Fragments of memory. Stories. Different names, different places. But always the same horse. Nameless. Silent. Showing up exactly when someone needed him most. And staying until the pain passed. Silas read every single one. In silence. Once, he carried a letter out to the stall. Read it out loud to Winterheart. And somehow, the horse listened. The silent healer. No one called him Wild anymore. No one asked where he came from. Because maybe he didn't belong to any one place. Maybe he belonged to everyone who needed healing. Late March. The snow began to melt. The sky over Bitterroot no longer bore the dense gray of winter, but instead a pale, blurred blue, like a memory just starting to resurface. The forest canopy began to weep, dripping into rivulets that shimmered with the season's first sunlight. Winterheart, now nearly fully recovered, roamed freely around the open paddock. His gait was firm, his eyes no longer heavy but bright, lifting whenever a sound stirred in the trees. Silas stood on the porch, sipping a cold cup of coffee. That's when he heard it, a low engine hum in the distance, unmistakably a large van. The vehicle stopped in front of the cabin. The door opened. 6 men stepped out. They didn't look like tourists. They didn't look like locals either. One used a cane. One wore fingerless gloves. Another had tattoos snaking down both arms. But they all shared one thing, a look in their eyes, weathered, hollow, yet hungering for something they couldn't quite name. Silas stepped forward. The one in front extended his hand, gripping hard. "You Creed?" "I am. My name's Tyler Lane. We were part of Margot's therapy program. Years ago. When we heard about the horse, saw the photo, we knew. We just knew. That's him." Silas didn't ask questions. He just nodded and opened the wooden gate leading to the fenced area behind the cabin. Winterheart stood beneath an old pine, ears pricked forward, as if he'd been waiting for them. Tyler stepped slowly. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped. "Is it really you?" Winterheart stepped closer, lowered his head, lifted one front leg, and then, just like in the old days, he rested his head gently on the veteran's shoulder. Tyler dropped to his knees. He didn't sob, but his shoulders trembled violently. "You're still here," he whispered, voice thick. "You're real." Another man stepped forward, broad, bearded, with eyes dark and sunken. A military insignia tattoo coiled around his wrist. Winterheart turned toward him, walked forward slowly. No hesitation, no fear. He leaned in, pressed his cheek against the man's chest. "God," the man exhaled, placing a hand on the horse's neck. "I thought you were just a dream." One by one, the others approached. Time had changed their faces, softened their voices. But to Winterheart, it was as if nothing had been forgotten, nothing left behind. The youngest man, barely into his 30s, stood silent the longest. When he finally stepped forward, he kept his distance. Winterheart walked toward him, paused. The man fell to his knees, as if instinctively. The horse lowered his head, gently touched his forehead to the man's. The same gesture, the same signal. "I see you. I'm here." Silas stayed back. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched. What unfolded before him wasn't just between man and horse anymore. It was memory. It was resurrection. A kind of magic once labeled therapy, but now, clearly, something more. One of the veterans turned towards Silas. "Back then, I almost ended it. This horse, he didn't do anything. Just stood next to me. For 3 straight hours. Didn't flinch. Didn't leave. Didn't judge. And somehow, I stopped feeling invisible." A hush settled over the moment. Then the man reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, an old, warped dog tag. "I buried it that day," he said quietly. "But today, I brought it back. To show him. I made it." Silas didn't speak. But he looked down at his own hands, then back at Winterheart. And he understood. This horse, he wasn't just an animal. He was a reminder that people can fall, and they can rise. Not because someone talks them into it, but because something or someone chooses to stay. That night, after the vets had fallen asleep in the cabin, Silas stepped outside with Winterheart. Moonlight streamed through the pines, casting a silver hush over the paddock. The youngest veteran, the one who had knelt, couldn't sleep. He came out, wrapped in a light coat, and stood watching the horse in the moonlight. No one spoke. Winterheart walked over slowly, pressed his head against the man's chest. As if to say, "You're still here. And so am I." The man began to cry. Not from pain, but from the unfamiliar ache of being held onto. Later that afternoon, Silas took Winterheart for a walk through the old forest. The breeze was light, the sun slipped through the trees. Neither spoke, but each step carried the weight of remembered stories. As they turned for home, Winterheart, like always, rested his head softly against Silas's shoulder. Silas whispered, "Soon, someone's gonna ask where you came from." Winterheart didn't answer. But maybe he'd never left. A week after the old faces returned, the Bitterroot forest remained silent, as if it were guarding a secret that had finally been spoken aloud. In a clearing near where Winterheart used to stand each morning, a new wooden post had been placed. Simple, unpainted, unadorned. Just a single line carved by hand with a sharp but careful blade. Winterheart, the one who stayed. They didn't call it a ceremony. Just a quiet gathering of a few people, a few glances, and more silence than words. Jonas lit a fire in the clearing. Margot sat beside a veteran who rested his hand on his knee like in prayer. Others laid pine branches at the base of the post, a wordless offering of gratitude. Silas stepped forward. His hands were empty, but something full stirred in his chest. He looked toward the open pen, where Winterheart stood just beyond the wooden fence, head slightly tilted, eyes clear and steady. Then Silas spoke. "There are horses born to ride. Some born to pull, to work, to run. But a rare few are born simply to stand still." His voice was firm but quiet. Not a speech. Just a truth. He didn't need reins. Didn't need a saddle. Didn't need to be called by name. He just needed to be there, still and steady, so that anyone in need could look into his eyes and see they still existed. An old man nodded. A woman wiped a tear. No one clapped. They knew some things don't need applause. They speak in their own way. When the others left, Silas stayed behind. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the melting snow. He opened the pen gate. Winterheart didn't bolt. Didn't neigh. He just stood there, gazing into the woods. As if to ask, "Is it time to go now?" But then, he turned back. Silas stepped forward and laid a hand on his neck. The warmth of the horse's skin seeped into his palm, familiar, like an old promise. Silas whispered, "Thank you for saving both of us." That night, the camp returned to normal. But it was a new kind of normal. Someone pinned a photo of Winterheart near the infirmary tent. Someone placed a hand-carved horse figurine on the kitchen shelf. Someone, probably Jonas, started saying the horse's full name each time he passed. Winterheart, the silent healer. Everyone who left Bitterroot took a story with them. Not to tell, but to keep. Because some stories are meant to be held in silence. Like the press of a forehead. Or standing side by side in a snowstorm. Not every wound needs words to heal. Not everyone who falls needs to be pulled back up by force. Sometimes, all we really need is an eye that listens. A presence that doesn't demand. A soul that chooses to stay, even when no one asked it to. Winterheart wasn't a miracle. He was a living memory. Proof that quiet presence can save an entire life. If you've ever felt invisible, remember, there are things that see you, even in silence. And they wait. And sometimes, a new life begins. Not with a call, but with a simple nod. From a creature who never needed words. Thank you for following the story of Winterheart. If this story touched your heart, leave us a comment below. Tell us, have you ever met your own Winterheart? Tap like if you believe in the power of healing. Share this story with someone who needs a little hope. And don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory for more true, untamed, and quietly powerful tales. Because sometimes, heroes don't wear capes. They just stand beside you when you can't stand at all.